The night Olive Garrison crossed the Red River, she lost everything except her life, and some mornings she was not entirely certain that had been the better deal. It was the spring of 1873, and the crossing had been a fool's errand from the start. Everyone on the wagon train had known it, but Reverend Holt had declared the water low enough, and no one had wanted to argue with a man who carried a Bible in one hand and a compass in the other. The river had not agreed with Reverend Holt's assessment. By the time the current finished having its say, 3 wagons were gone, 2 mules were drowned, and Olive's older brother Thomas was somewhere beneath the churning brown water along with every possession she had carried from Tennessee. She was 23 years old, standing on the western bank of the Red River in soaked wool skirts, and she had nothing left but the clothes on her body and a small tin locket around her neck that contained a photograph of her mother, who had been dead 6 years already. She had pressed the locket so hard against her chest during the crossing that it had left a small red mark on her sternum, a bruise shaped like grief itself. The wagon train pushed west regardless. It always did. That was the nature of westward movement in those years. It had no reverse gear, no sentiment for what it left behind. You buried your dead on the trail and kept moving, and if you had no dead to bury because the river had taken them, you moved anyway, and you learned to carry your mourning inside you like a stone in your chest that you never put down. Olive moved. She had no choice. A widow named Hattie Combs took her in, let her sleep in the back of her wagon, and in exchange, Olive cooked and mended and kept silent about the flask of whiskey Hattie pulled from beneath the driver's bench every evening at sundown. It was a fair arrangement. Hattie never asked questions, and Olive was not yet ready to answer any. But the nights were their own particular cruelty. Every time Olive closed her eyes, she was back in the water. She could feel the cold current pulling at her, feel Thomas's hand torn from hers, hear the sound of the wagon wheels grinding against river rock, and then the awful silence when the sound stopped. She would jerk awake gasping, her heart slamming against her ribs, and lie there in the darkness listening to Hattie snore with the peaceful abandon of a woman whose conscience and whiskey were on speaking terms. By the time the wagon train reached the small Texas town of Calder's Bluff in early May, Olive had not slept more than 2 or 3 consecutive hours in almost 3 weeks. She moved through the days like a woman walking underwater, her face pale, her eyes carrying the particular hollowness of someone whose body was present but whose spirit had not quite caught up. Calder's Bluff was not much to look at. It sat on the open plain like something a child had stacked carelessly from scraps of wood and wishful thinking. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a small church that was also a schoolhouse 3 days a week, and a scattering of homes and farms radiating outward from the main street like the spokes of an uneven wheel. The population hovered around 200 souls, which was enough to feel like a town if you had come from somewhere smaller, and not enough if you had come from somewhere larger, which Olive had. Still, the wagon train stopped to resupply, and that was where things changed. She was sitting on the edge of the water trough outside the general store, staring at nothing in particular, when the man came out carrying a 50-pound sack of grain over one shoulder as easily as another man might carry a coat. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where the sweat had gotten to it, and he wore the clothes of a working rancher: worn boots, canvas trousers, a shirt that had been washed so many times the blue had faded almost to gray. He was 26 or 27, she guessed, with a face that had been made serious by sun and responsibility but not unkind by either. He almost walked past her. Then he stopped. She must have looked terrible, she thought later. She must have looked like precisely what she was, a woman at the ragged edge of herself. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. The question was so simple and so sincere that Olive found herself unable to answer it for a moment. People had been asking her variations of that question for weeks, but no one had asked it the way this man did, with his full attention, as though her answer genuinely mattered to whatever he did next. "I am not sure," she said honestly, which surprised both of them. He set the grain sack down against the wall of the store with a controlled thud and looked at her properly. "That's an honest answer," he said. "I have not been sleeping well," she added, which was the most tremendous understatement she had ever made, but it was all she could find at that moment. "How long?" he asked. She thought about lying. "Since the crossing," she said instead. "The Red River, 3 weeks ago." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of careful attention, like a man who had just realized he was standing near something that required gentleness. "Were you one of the wagons from Holt's train?" "Yes." "I heard about that crossing," he said quietly. "I am sorry for what happened." "Did you know about it?" she asked, not unkindly, just tired and genuinely curious about how far the news had traveled. "Word comes through Calder's Bluff fast," he said. "Any news from the trails comes through here. We hear most things." He paused. "I heard someone lost a brother." She looked at him. "That was me." He was quiet for a moment, not rushing to fill the silence with hollow condolence, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Then he said, "My name is Edwin Ashford. I run a small cattle spread about 4 miles east of town. If you need anything while you are here, I mean that sincerely." "Olive Garrison," she said. "And thank you, Mr. Ashford." He picked up the grain sack again, gave her a nod that was both respectful and warm, and went to load it onto his wagon. She watched him go without meaning to. Hattie Combs found her 20 minutes later and said, in the blunt way she had of stating observations, "You are looking at that man's wagon and not the road, Olive. First time I have seen you look at anything with interest in 3 weeks." "He was kind," Olive said simply. Hattie made a sound that contained an entire editorial about kindness and men and the particular trouble that arose from their intersection, but she said nothing more about it. The wagon train was planning to leave the following morning, pushing on toward New Mexico territory. But Olive found herself in a conversation that afternoon with the town's only physician, a compact, energetic woman of 40 named Dr. Marion Fell, who had come to Calder's Bluff from Philadelphia 10 years earlier and had apparently decided Texas suited her considerably better than Pennsylvania ever had. Dr. Fell had seen Olive state clearly within about 60 seconds of encountering her outside the general store, and had maneuvered her into her small office with the efficient practicality of someone who dealt with stubborn patients regularly. The office smelled of camphor and dried herbs and paper, and Olive found herself sitting in a straight-back chair answering questions before she quite knew how it had happened. "You are not sleeping," Dr. Fell said, not as a question. "No. Nightmares. Every time I close my eyes I am back in the water." Dr. Fell wrote something in a small notebook. "And you are continuing on with the wagon train tomorrow." "I had planned to," Olive said. "I have a cousin in New Mexico territory, in a town called Las Cruces. She wrote to me before I left Tennessee and said there was work there and she had room." Dr. Fell set down her pen. "May I speak frankly to you, Miss Garrison? Please. You are in no condition to continue traveling tomorrow. Your body is running on memory and stubbornness, which are admirable things, but they are not a substitute for rest. If you push on in this state, you will get sick, or you will make an error in judgment on the trail that puts you in danger. Your cousin will still be in Las Cruces in a month. The question is whether you will be upright when you get there." Olive stared at the wall behind Dr. Fell's head, where a diagram of the human skeletal system was pinned with 4 neat tacks. "I cannot afford to stay," she said. "I have almost no money." "There is work to be had in Calder's Bluff," Dr. Fell said. "The Branfield family needs a woman to help with cooking and the younger children, while Mrs. Branfield recovers from a difficult birth. It pays a small wage and includes meals and a proper bed. You would stay perhaps 3 or 4 weeks, rest properly, save a little money, and then make arrangements to travel to your cousin with considerably better odds of arriving in one piece." Olive was quiet for a long moment. The thought of a proper bed was almost unbearably appealing, and at the same time it frightened her, because she knew that lying down in a quiet room would mean confronting everything she had been outrunning since the river took Thomas. "I will think on it tonight," she said. Doctor. Fell nodded. That is all I ask. She thought on it that night, lying in Hattie's wagon and watching the Texas stars through the gap in the canvas, and in the morning she went to Hattie and told her she was staying. Hattie gave her a long look, then reached under the driver's bench, pulled out the flask, took a measured drink and put it back. Because of the sleeping, she asked. Partly, Olive said. Hattie made the same editorial sound as before, but her eyes were warm, and when she pulled Olive into a brief, fierce hug that smelled of wood smoke and whiskey and something indefinably maternal, Olive did not hold back the tears she had been carrying since the river. You write when you get to your cousin, Hattie said. I will. The wagon train pulled out at first light, and Olive stood on the main street of Calder's Bluff and watched it go until the dust settled and the silence came back in, and then she turned and walked toward the Branfield house with her small tin locket pressed in her palm like a compass. The Branfield household was chaos made domestic. There were 4 children: Emmett, who was 8, Clara, who was 6, and the twins, a boy and a girl named Robbie and June, who were 3 and had apparently made a pact before birth to never sleep simultaneously and never be quiet in the same room. Mrs. Branfield, whose name was Ruth, was recovering from the birth of the newest Branfield, a boy they had named Henry, and she was equal parts grateful for help and embarrassed that she needed it, which made her a little prickly in the way that proud women sometimes were when circumstances humbled them. Olive liked her immediately. She had a way with children, something she had always known about herself without quite knowing how she had come to know it, and within 2 days the Branfield children had decided she was the most interesting person in Calder's Bluff, which was not saying everything but was saying something. She cooked, she mended. She chased Robbie and June out of the henhouse 3 separate times, and in the evenings she sat with Ruth while Henry nursed and they talked about small things and sometimes large ones, and it began to feel almost like the ordinary texture of a life. But the nights were still terrible. She had a room to herself, a real room with a real bed and a quilt that Ruth's mother had made, and the mattress was cotton stuffed and softer than anything she had slept on since leaving Tennessee. She would lie down in it each night with a profound physical relief that lasted approximately 10 minutes before the dreams came, or the half-dreams, or the state that was worse than either, that suspended wakefulness, where she could feel the cold river water and hear Thomas shouting her name and reach for his hand in the dark and find only the quilt. She would sit up then, in the deep of the night, and light the small candle on the bedside table, and she would sit with her knees drawn to her chest and wait for morning. It was on her 5th night in Calder's Bluff that she heard the soft sound of a horse outside at an unusual hour and looked out her window to find Edwin Ashford tying his horse to the Branfield fence post. He was carrying something wrapped in cloth, and when she came to the front door, because it seemed rude to let him stand outside at nearly midnight, he looked up without apparent surprise. I saw the light, he said simply, nodding toward her window. I have been coming through town late this week. One of my mares is having a difficult time with a foal, and I have been calling on Dr. Fell. I saw your light on last night, too. I am sorry, she said, and then immediately felt foolish for apologizing for existing. Don't apologize, he said, and the firmness in his voice was gentle rather than scolding. He held out the cloth-wrapped parcel. My housekeeper made too much of this today. Lavender and chamomile. She swears by it. Olive unwrapped it to find a small cloth sachet, neatly sewn, and a tin of loose tea. She stood in the doorway holding it and felt something peculiar moving through her, not quite gratitude, though it was that too, but something softer and more destabilizing. That is very thoughtful, Mr. Ashford, she managed. Edwin, he said, if it suits you. Edwin, she said. It did suit her. He stood there a moment, hat in his hands, and the Texas night spread out behind him vast and star-heavy and warm with approaching summer. The dreams are the worst part, I expect, he said, and the way he said it was not a guess but a statement of someone who had been there. She looked at him. You have lost someone, she said. He looked out at the night briefly, then back at her. My father 4 years ago, cholera, and my younger brother to a fall from a horse 2 years after that. He was quiet. The nights were bad for a long time. "Do they get better?" she asked, and she was surprised by how young her own voice sounded asking it, how stripped of its usual composure. "Yes," he said. Not quickly and not in a straight line, but yes, he paused. "The lavender helps a little, and having something real to hold on to." "What did you hold on to?" she asked. The question surprised both of them. She watched him consider it seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things. "The ranch," he said. "The horses. The fact that there was work to do in the morning. A small, quiet smile. The idea that they would not have wanted me to stay broken forever." Olive felt something in her chest shift, not dramatically, but genuinely, like a door that had been stuck opening just enough to let a line of light through. She pressed the sachet gently between her palms and smelled the lavender rising from it. "Thank you," she said, and this time it came out less like a formality and more like she meant it in all the ways there were to mean it. He put his hat back on. "Good night, Olive," he said, and walked back to his horse and rode toward the edge of town, and she stood in the doorway long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded. She slept 4 hours that night. Not peacefully, exactly, but continuously, which was more than she had managed in 3 weeks. In the days that followed, Edwin became a natural part of the texture of Calder's Bluff for her. He came into town every 2 or 3 days for supplies, or to see the blacksmith, or to attend to the particular small business of running a working ranch, and he always seemed to find a moment to stop and speak with her. Not intrusively. He had an instinct for when she needed conversation, and when she needed silence, which she found remarkable and somewhat unusual in people generally. He would stop at the Branfield fence while she was hanging washing and ask how she was, genuinely wanting to know, and she would tell him, genuinely. They talked about small things first: the weather, the price of grain, the ongoing saga of Robbie and June's campaign against the henhouse. Then gradually about larger things, the way real conversation always moved if you let it, in slow circles that widened. She told him about Tennessee, about the farm where she had grown up, about her mother dying when she was 17, and the way Thomas had kept the whole thing running through sheer force of refusal to accept that it couldn't be done. She told him about the decision to come west, which had been Thomas's idea, and how she had argued against it and then relented, and how that relenting sat in her chest sometimes like something she could not quite forgive herself for. "You could not have known," Edwin said. "No," she agreed, "but I think about it anyway." "That is what grief does," he said. "It finds all the places you could have done differently and sets up permanent residence there. The only thing you can do is start charging it rent." She laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and then felt immediately self-conscious about it, as though laughing were somehow disloyal to Thomas, which she knew was not rational but felt true. Edwin watched her laugh and then watched her retreat from it, and he said nothing, only looked at her in that steady, attentive way of his that made her feel seen in a way she was not entirely sure she was comfortable with yet. He told her about the ranch, 80 acres, a modest herd of cattle, 3 horses he had bought at significant personal sacrifice, and now loved with a passion he freely admitted was disproportionate. He had built the main house himself, he said, with help from his neighbor Calloway and 2 hired hands, and it was not beautiful but it was solid, which he seemed to regard as the more important quality. "Where are you from originally?" She asked him one evening when they were standing outside the general store, the sky going gold and rose behind the church steeple. "Virginia," he said, and something moved across his face, brief and complicated. "I came out here in 1868. It was time." She sensed there was more to that story but did not press, which seemed to please him, and they stood watching the sunset in a comfortable silence that felt entirely unlike anything she would have imagined finding in a place she had only stopped at by accident. It was Ruth Branfield who said it first, of course. Ruth had recovered enough by the second week to sit in the kitchen while Olive cooked, and she had the observational acuity of a woman who had spent years watching people from the particular vantage point of a household. Edwin Ashford has not come through town this many times in any 2-week stretch since the year he built his fences, Ruth said, cutting carrots with careful, methodical strokes, her tone perfectly casual. He has business in town, Olive said. He has business on his ranch, Ruth said. Edwin Ashford does not come to town unless he has strong reason. He is not a man who wanders. A pause. He is a good man, steady, honest. He had a difficult time after his brother died, but he came through it. Another pause, the knife moving through a carrot. He was engaged once, about 3 years ago. Woman named Cecily Pratt. She decided Texas was not agreeable to her and went back to Missouri. Olive said nothing, focusing on the stew she was stirring. He has not looked at anyone since then, Ruth said. The way he looks at you. Olive kept stirring. I am just noting it, Ruth said mildly. You are doing considerably more than noting it, Olive said, and Ruth laughed, which made Henry, asleep in his basket by the stove, stir briefly and sigh, but she thought about it. She thought about it while she lay awake at 3 in the morning, with the lavender sachet on her pillow and the candle burning, and the night pressing in around her. She thought about the way he said her name, which he always said fully, never shortened, always Olive, as though the name were something he intended to treat with respect. She thought about the quality of his attention, which was the rarest thing she had encountered in a man, not the attention that was performance, looking at her so she would notice him looking, but the attention that was genuine interest, that wanted to know who she actually was rather than who she appeared to be. She thought about Thomas, who would have liked him. Thomas had always had a talent for identifying which people were worth knowing from a first conversation, and she had inherited enough of that to trust her own version of it. And every instinct she had said that Edwin Ashford was worth knowing. The question was what she was willing to do about it, given that she had a cousin in Las Cruces and a plan, which was not much of a plan but was the only one she had. The answer came, as answers often did, from an unexpected direction. She had been in Calder's Bluff for 11 days when she woke at 2 in the morning from the dream, the river, Thomas's hand, the current, and could not simply lie in the dark this time. The walls felt too close and the night felt too heavy, so she dressed quietly and went outside, telling herself the cool air would settle her, and walked to the edge of the main street, where the town ended and the plain began and you could see the sky all the way down to the horizon. She was standing there, her arms folded around herself against the night chill, when she heard footsteps on the dry dirt and turned to find Edwin walking toward her from the direction of Dr. Fell's house, his hat in his hand. He stopped when he saw her. The mare, he said by way of explanation, because of course she would wonder. The foal came through tonight, both doing well. I am glad, she said. He looked at her for a moment, taking in the hour and the fact that she was standing outside alone and the expression she was fairly sure she was wearing. You did not sleep, he said. No. He was quiet for a moment, then walked over and stood beside her, looking out at the same plain she had been looking at, the same vast dark sky. He did not say anything immediately, and she did not feel any pressure to fill the silence. I keep dreaming about the river, she said eventually. Every night. Sometimes more than once. I am there again and I cannot hold on to him, and I wake up, and for a moment I believe I could have done something different. You could not have, he said. I know that in the daylight, she said. At night I forget. He turned to look at her, and in the dark his eyes were very serious and very warm at the same time, which was the particular combination that made Edwin Ashford the kind of person she had not expected to find in a small Texas town that she had not intended to stop at. Has there been a single night since the crossing that you slept fully through? He asked. No, she said honestly. Not one. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life, would tell their children about in later years when they asked where love had started, a question that children always asked and parents rarely answered with the full truth. He said, "Then I will sit up with you until you do." She stared at him. "Edwin, you have a ranch to run." "You cannot," "I can sit on this step," he said, nodding toward the bench in front of the general store, "and talk to you or sit quietly with you or simply be present, and that is something I am entirely capable of doing." He paused. "You should not be awake alone at 3 in the morning. Nobody should. It is the loneliest time of day, and you have been carrying this alone for too long." She felt something break open in her chest, not painfully, but inevitably, the way ice broke in a river in spring, not violently but with a deep gathering inevitability that had been building long before the crack appeared. She pressed her hands together, the locket warm in her palm, and she did not cry, though she was very close to it. "Why?" she asked very quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, because you are the most genuinely honest person I have met in a very long time, and because you laugh like you are surprised by it, and because you are trying very hard not to be broken by something that would have broken most people, and because I find that I would like very much to know you, Olive Garrison, for a considerable length of time." She looked at him in the dark of the Texas night, and she said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would be equal to that, and he seemed to understand that too, because he simply sat down on the bench outside the general store and folded his hat on his knee and looked out at the plain. She sat down beside him. They talked until the eastern sky began to gray, not about anything specific, about Virginia and Tennessee, about horses and cattle, and what a field of lavender smelled like in summer, about the things Thomas had said that had made her laugh, about the way his brother James had once tried to shoe a horse that had not wanted to be shod, and had ended up stuck in a mud pit for 45 minutes to his enormous personal embarrassment. They talked the way people talked when they were not trying to impress each other, and the night got lighter by degrees, and somewhere around 5 in the morning, Olive felt her eyes growing genuinely heavy for the first time in 3 weeks. "Go in," Edwin said, and his voice was soft. "I will wait here until you are settled." "That is not necessary," she said, and even she could hear that her voice had blurred at the edges with exhaustion. "I know," he said. "Go on." She stood up, and then she looked at him sitting there on the bench in the gray pre-dawn, hat in his hands, and she said, "Edwin, thank you." "Sleep, Olive," he said. She went in, and she lay down on the cotton-stuffed mattress under Ruth's mother's quilt, and she pressed the lavender sachet to her face and closed her eyes, and she slept fully, entirely, without the river, for 6 unbroken hours. She woke at noon to the sound of Robbie and June conducting what sounded like a trial of some kind in the kitchen below, in which a rag doll was apparently being accused of crimes against the corn cake, and she lay there in the ordinary domestic noise of the Branfield household and felt something new and strange, which was the tentative, cautious beginning of hope. She did not see Edwin that day, but on the following morning he came past the Branfield fence while she was in the garden, and he stopped, and she looked up at him, and they both smiled with the particular sheepishness of people who had said true things in the dark and were now facing each other in the light. "You slept," he said, and it was not a question. 6 hours, she said, without dreaming. His smile deepened, and it transformed his face in a way she was beginning to recognize and to actively want to cause. "Good," he said. Ruth Branfield, who had a talent for appearing in doorways at significant moments, appeared in the doorway at that moment with Henry on her hip and said, to no one in particular, "Edwin Ashford, I have extra biscuits if you have time for coffee." Edwin did, it turned out, have time for coffee. He sat at the Branfield kitchen table, and Ruth served coffee and biscuits, and then took the children outside with the practiced efficiency of a woman conducting a deliberate operation, and Olive sat across the table from Edwin Ashford in the morning light, and they looked at each other with the calm directness of people who had passed some invisible threshold. "I want to ask you something," Edwin said, "and you can say no without it changing anything about my previous offer to drive away the dark." "All right," she said. "Would you allow me to court you properly? I understand you have a plan and a cousin in New Mexico, and I am not asking you to abandon those things. I am asking if you would let me." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with genuine care. If you would let me be someone who matters to you while you are here, and perhaps after." The kitchen was warm, the coffee was strong, and somewhere outside Robbie was shrieking about something that had happened to his stick. And Olive Garrison sat in the plain morning light of a Texas household and made a decision that she understood, even as she made it, was one of those decisions that a life pivoted on. "Yes," she said. He let out a slow breath that told her he had been less certain than he appeared. "Good," he said, in the same tone he had used the night before, and she laughed, that surprised laugh that she was beginning to stop feeling guilty about. What followed was the particular and lovely process of two people deciding to know each other, which in 1873 in a small Texas town meant a series of events that were individually small and collectively transformative. He took her riding on a Sunday afternoon, which she had not done since Tennessee, and she was embarrassed by how much she enjoyed it and how good it felt to be on a horse, moving across the open plain with the wind in her face and the smell of grass and distance in her nose. He was a good rider himself, easy and quiet with his horse, and he did not make comments about her skill or lack thereof, just rode beside her and pointed out things, a hawk riding a thermal, a distant line of trees that marked a creek bed, the faint remnants of an older trail that cut across the plain at an angle. "How long have you been here?" she asked, meaning the land itself, the feeling of it. "Long enough that it feels like mine," he said. "And not mine too, if you understand that." She did understand it. The West had that quality. It was not a domesticated landscape. It held itself apart from ownership even as people pressed claims on it, remained wild at the edges of every farm and town, reminded you daily that it had been here before you and would be here after. She went to the ranch for the first time on a Wednesday in the third week of May, with Ruth's permission and Emmett Branfield as a chaperone, since Emmett had been lobbying to see Edwin's horses with a passion that bordered on religious devotion. The ranch was exactly as Edwin had described it, not beautiful in any ornamented way, but solid and considered, the house sitting low against the landscape as though it had grown up from it rather than been placed there. There was a barn that smelled of hay and horses, a cookhouse separate from the main house, a vegetable garden that was doing well, and the mare who had survived her difficult foaling was in the pasture with her new foal, both of them glossy in the morning light. Emmett was immediately and entirely in love with the horses and went off with Edwin's hired hand, a quiet man named Dill, who seemed to regard Emmett with the resigned patience of someone who had dealt with enthusiastic 8-year-olds before. Olive stood at the fence watching the mare and foal, and Edwin stood beside her, close but not inappropriately so, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that you had to earn, that only arrived after you had said enough real things to each other. "It is a good place," she said. "It is becoming one," he said, and she understood that he meant something more than the physical property. He showed her the house, which was as honest inside as out practical furniture, a stone fireplace, a kitchen that had clearly been designed by someone who valued function, a small shelf of books that she stopped at with genuine pleasure. She pulled one out, a copy of Tennyson's poems, worn at the spine, and looked at him with surprise. "My mother's," he said. "She made me bring one thing from Virginia that was not practical, and I chose that." "Do you read him?" she asked. "Sometimes, at night." He paused. "He understood grief rather well, I think." She put the book back carefully and looked around the main room of the house, at the honest plainness of it, and the quality of the light coming through the windows Edwin had clearly positioned with thought, and she let herself imagine, briefly, what it would be like to live in a place like this, and the imagining did not frighten her the way it might have a month ago. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything about what they were both thinking, but the space between them had changed in quality, had become charged with the specific awareness of people on the verge of something. It was Emmett who broke the moment, appearing around the side of the barn with a piece of straw in his hair and a look of absolute satisfaction on his face. "Mr. Ashford," he announced solemnly, "Dill says I have a natural way with horses." "Dill is an excellent judge," Edwin said, and his voice was perfectly even, but when he glanced at Olive there was laughter in his eyes that she felt like warmth. She slept better every night. Not without the occasional nightmare. Not without the occasional 3 in the morning hour when she sat up and held the locket and talked quietly to Thomas in the dark. She had started doing that, holding small, silent conversations with her brother, and it helped in the way that things helped that were not rational but were true. But the unbroken terror had loosened its grip, and she could feel herself coming back to herself in the gradual, tentative way of something that has been frozen and is slowly thawing. Edwin knew, without being told, when she had a bad night. He had a quality of perception about her that she found alternately moving and slightly unnerving. He would come past the Branfield fence on those mornings with an extra coffee from the saloon's kitchen. The saloon served breakfast, which was perhaps the most practical thing about it, and hand it over the fence without fanfare and ask her what she wanted to talk about, which was always the right question because sometimes she wanted to talk about the dream, and sometimes she wanted to talk about absolutely anything else, and he was equally capable of either. She told him about Thomas properly. On a long evening in late May when they were sitting on the Branfield porch while the children were asleep and the stars were enormous overhead. She told him who Thomas had been: funny, stubborn, terrible at cards and convinced he was good, the best shot in their county, deeply gentle with animals, and quietly devoted to her in the understated way of older brothers who could not always say the thing they felt but showed it in the watching, the protecting, the staying up late to wait for her to come home safe. She cried while she told it, which she had not quite allowed herself to do fully before, and Edwin sat beside her and did not try to stop it or fix it or redirect it, just sat with his hand resting close to hers on the porch railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it without it being presumptuous, and let her cry until she was done. "He sounds like someone I would have liked," Edwin said, when she was quiet. "He would have liked you," she said. He always had a theory that you could tell the quality of a man by whether he sat down in the middle of a conversation or kept looking for the door. Edwin smiled. "I prefer sitting down." "I noticed," she said. He looked at her then with an expression she had not quite seen on his face before, something open and decided, and he said, "I think you know how I feel about you, Olive." "I have some idea," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about it," he said. "I am not a man who is easy with declarations. I was taught that showing was preferable to saying, but I have been reconsidering the wisdom of that in your case." He paused, and she could see him making himself be plain, which cost him something and was therefore worth more. "I love you." "I am aware that this is a significant thing to say to a woman you have known for less than 4 weeks, and I am aware that your situation is not settled and that you have a cousin in Las Cruces and a plan. I am not asking you to abandon anything. I am just telling you so that you know, and so that whatever you decide with the full information." The night was very still. The stars were very bright. Olive looked at Edwin Ashford, who had sat up with her in the dark, who had brought her lavender and chamomile, who had listened to her cry about her brother without once trying to make it easier than it was, who had looked at her on a water trough outside a general store and asked if she was all right and meant it, and she felt something so clear and so certain move through her that she did not question it. "Edwin," she said, "I wrote to my cousin last week." He was still watching her. "I told her that I might be delayed indefinitely," she said, "and that I was well, and that I had found something unexpected in a place I had not planned to stop." He was very quiet for a moment. "Then, and is that still true?" "It is more true now than when I wrote it," she said. He reached over and took her hand on the porch railing, which was not a small gesture in 1873, and they both knew it. And she looked down at his hand over hers and felt the solidity of it, the warmth of it, and she thought of the river and Thomas and the long insomniac weeks, and she thought of the lavender sachet and the bench outside the general store in the pre-dawn gray, and the way he had said "sleep, Olive," and she turned her hand over and held his properly. "I love you too," she said. Surprisingly quickly and rather thoroughly. His smile broke across his face. in a way that she would spend the rest of her life working to cause as often as possible. They sat on the porch for a long time after that, talking and not talking in equal measure, and the Texas night wrapped itself around them with the particular extravagance of June, warm and vast and smelling of grass and distance. And Olive thought that she had come to this place by disaster and grief and insomnia, and a chain of circumstances she would not have chosen, and that none of that made what she had found here any less real or any less hers. Edwin asked her to marry him on a Saturday in early June, which was 5 weeks after she had first sat down on the water trough outside the general store. He did it practically and earnestly, and with something close to nervousness, which she found deeply endearing because he was a man who seemed unruffled by most things, and clearly found this thing entirely ruffling. He had asked her to walk with him, which they had established as a regular practice, an evening circuit of the town that took them past the church and the livery and out along the edge of the plain before turning back, and he had been quiet for most of it, which was unusual enough that she had started watching him sideways. They stopped at the edge of the plain, where the town ended and the sky became enormous, and he turned to her and said, with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed and then abandoned the rehearsal in favor of honesty, "I want to marry you, Olive. I want you to live in my house and help me build something worth building, and I want to sit up with you through whatever nights are hard and wake up beside you on the ones that aren't, and I want to know what you think about everything and hear you laugh for the rest of my life. I am not asking you to give up yourself. I am asking you to let me be part of your life. Will you?" She had known it was coming, in the way that you knew a storm was coming from the quality of the light an hour before, and she had known what she would say, and she said it. "Yes," she said, "with my whole heart, yes." He took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that was simple and whole and uncomplicated, the way great feelings sometimes arrived after the complicated ones had cleared, and then he kissed her for the first time, which was brief and warm and tasted faintly of the coffee he had drunk that afternoon, and she put her hand against his jaw and felt the roughness of it and thought, "Here, this is the place. This is what solid ground feels like." They were married in Calder's Bluff on the 15th of June, 1873, in the small church that was also a schoolhouse 3 days a week, with Ruth Branfield and Dr. Marion Fell and the Branfield children all present, and a handful of townspeople who had watched the thing developing with the particular warm investment of a small community that paid attention to its own. Emmett Branfield stood very straight throughout the ceremony with the solemnity of a boy who understood he was witnessing something important. Robbie and June sat on either side of Ruth and ate the cornbread they had brought because they were 3 years old and not yet capable of participating in ceremonies without provisions. The reverend who performed the ceremony was a gentle man named Vance, who had a talent for the kind of wedding words that were simple and true rather than flowery and impersonal. And when he spoke about the covenant of marriage, he spoke about it as two people choosing to be present to each other's lives in all their difficulty and beauty. And Olive stood beside Edwin in her best dress, which was not her finest dress because that was at the bottom of the Red River, but was decent and had been pressed carefully the night before, and she listened to the words and felt them settle into her like something she had always been moving toward without knowing it. Edwin said his vows in a low, steady voice, looking at her the entire time, and she said hers, and when the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Edwin kissed her with considerably more conviction than the first time, and Ruth Branfield made a happy noise, and little June said, at full volume, "Olive is crying," and Olive was, though she was laughing at the same time, which was increasingly the state Edwin Ashford put her in. They held a small celebration at the Branfield house afterward, with food that half the town had contributed, and a fiddle player named Gaines who played dance music with an enthusiasm that more than compensated for any technical limitations. Olive danced with Edwin and then with Emmett, who was a dedicated if uncoordinated dancer, and then with Dr. Fell, who turned out to be excellent, and then with Edwin again for the slower songs that came in the evening as the celebration wound down. "Are you happy?" Edwin asked her quietly while they were dancing. She considered the question as she always did, with genuine thought rather than reflex. "I am more happy than I knew I was capable of being 3 weeks ago," she said. "And I think I am going to be considerably happier yet." He pulled her slightly closer, which was the most they could do in public in 1873, and she felt the warmth of him against her side and thought of Thomas with a kind of grief that had changed shape, still present, still real, but carrying the particular quality of a grief that was being held within a life rather than constituting the whole of it. She slept that night, their first night in Edwin's house, in Edwin's arms, and she did not dream of the river. The life they built together was not without difficulty, because no good life was. The summer of 1873 brought a drought that put pressure on the cattle and the garden both, and Edwin spent long days on horseback moving cattle to what water there was, coming home tired and dust-covered in ways that required patience from both of them. There were financial pressures in that first year that came from the drought, and from the fact that running a small ranch in Texas in the 1870s meant operating on margins that left no room for comfort. Olive had grown up on a farm. She understood drought and debt, and the particular strain that money pressures put on people who were otherwise fine together, and she was not someone who panicked or retreated into herself when things were hard. She worked. She expanded the garden where the water could reach. She took in mending and laundry from several households in town. She traded preserves and cooking skills for things they needed, and she kept the household accounts with a precision that Edwin called miraculous, and she called basic arithmetic. They argued sometimes real arguments, not the careful performances of people who were afraid of conflict, but the genuine disagreements of two people who had strong opinions and trusted each other enough to voice them. The first real argument was about whether to sell 2 of the cattle to shore up cash reserves, or to hold them through the autumn when prices would improve, and it lasted 2 days and was conducted in the direct, non-cruel way of people who had decided to fight fair, and they came to a conclusion that was mostly Edwin's plan with 2 modifications that were mostly Olive's, and they were both slightly smug about it in different directions, and the smugness made them laugh, which made the whole thing feel manageable. They also had the kind of joy that only lived in small things and ordinary days, the evening routine of sitting on the porch after the dinner dishes were done, the particular pleasure of Edwin reading to her from the Tennyson on winter nights when the fire was going, the way she had developed an understanding with the horses that Edwin watched with frank admiration, the inside jokes that developed between people who spent enough time together. She learned that he made terrible coffee and had somehow not noticed, and that he sang very quietly to himself when he was working and did not know she could hear, and that he had a habit of falling asleep in the reading chair after supper about once a week and waking up confused about the time, and she loved all of these things with the specific tenderness of love that had cleared the phase of performance and arrived at the real person. He learned that she was not a morning person despite rising early out of habit, and that she had a streak of stubbornness that ran bone-deep and could not be argued with but could be waited out, and that she talked to Thomas sometimes, quietly, usually when she was alone in the garden, and that this was something he left her to without comment or intrusion. He learned that her laugh was the loudest sound she made, and that she was invariably surprised by it, as though it arrived before she had decided to let it out. He learned that she could read a person in about 30 seconds and was almost never wrong about them, and he started consulting her instincts about everyone from new hired hands to traveling merchants. She still had difficult nights sometimes. They became less frequent as the months passed, but they did not disappear entirely, and when she woke in the dark from the dream of the river and could not resettle, she would lie still for a moment and then feel Edwin's arm tighten around her before she had said a word, which meant he had been awake too or had woken with her, and he would say quietly into the dark, "I am here," and that was enough. That was the whole of what was required. And she would breathe herself down from the adrenaline of the dream and fall back asleep with her head against his shoulder. "How do you always know?" she asked him once after one of those nights in the ordinary morning light. "I do not know," he said. "I just do." She thought that was perhaps the most romantic thing she had ever heard, and she told him so, and he looked slightly flustered by the compliment, which was also very endearing. In October of 1873, Olive received a letter from her cousin in Las Cruces. The cousin, whose name was Bate, had met a man herself and was thoroughly absorbed in that development. And she wrote with the kind of cheerful self-absorption of someone whose own romantic situation had made them generous about everyone else's. She was delighted about Edwin, she said, and when were they coming to visit, and she was sorry about Thomas, and she had always believed that Olive would land on her feet, which was what people said when they were not there for the fall but wanted credit for the landing. Olive wrote back a long letter, the kind she had always been good at, full of detail and honesty, and a description of the ranch and Edwin and the Branfield children and Dr. Fell and Calder's Bluff that was so complete Bate wrote back to say she felt she had been there herself. The drought broke in November with 3 days of steady rain that turned the plains soft and dark and made the air smell like something reborn. Edwin came in on the second evening of the rain soaked to the skin and grinning with relief, and Olive handed him a towel and a cup of coffee and stood back to let him have his moment of sheer satisfaction. And then he picked her up and spun her once, which was startlingly physical and made her shriek and then laugh. And he set her down and kissed her with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had been carrying significant anxiety for several months and just set it down. Spring of 1874 brought good grass and recovering cattle numbers, and a general sense of forward momentum that put Edwin in a light mood for most of March and April. It also brought the news in early May that Olive was pregnant. She had been fairly certain for 2 weeks before she told him, partly because she wanted to be sure, and partly because she was working through the complex array of feelings that the news produced. Joy, which was the dominant one, followed closely by a kind of tenderness so fierce it was almost pain, followed by the brief, involuntary grief of Thomas not being alive to know it. She told Edwin on an evening when they were both on the porch, the spring air warm and soft around them, and she just said it plainly because she had learned that plain was the way they did things. He was quiet for a very long moment, and she watched his profile and saw the sequence of things moving through his face, surprise, then something that was the word joy did not quite do justice to, then the particular quality of a man deciding, all at once, that everything mattered more than it had a moment ago. He turned to her and his eyes were bright, and she had never seen him cry, and he did not cry now exactly, but it was close, and he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Olive," he said, which was all he said, and it contained everything. She put her hands over his and leaned her head briefly against his forehead, and they stayed like that for a long moment, the spring evening around them, the plain dark and fragrant beyond the fence. "I wish Thomas could know," she said. "He knows," Edwin said, with the kind of simple certainty that was not religion and not superstition but was something else entirely, something earned and human. She believed him. Dr. Marion Fell attended the birth, which occurred in late November of 1874, and it was a long night but not a dangerous one. And at the end of it there was a boy, a solid, clear-lunged, spectacularly indignant boy, who announced his arrival with such force that Edwin, who had been sitting at the kitchen table approximately 40 feet away, heard him through 2 walls and laughed out loud with a pure, unself-conscious joy that was entirely new in Olive's experience of him. Dr. Fell brought him in, and Edwin held his son for the first time with the careful reverence of a man who understood he was holding something that made all previous definitions of importance seem slightly inadequate. He sat beside Olive's bed and held the baby and looked at him with an expression she wanted to sketch and keep forever. "Thomas," she said, when Edwin looked up at her over the baby's head, "if that suits you." Edwin looked back down at his son and said, "Thomas Garrison Ashford," and then looked at her again with that expression, and she reached over and put her hand on his arm, and they were quiet together with their son between them in the lamplight. The Texas winter dark outside and the house warm inside, and the circle of their family complete in this first shape it had taken, the first of several. The boy grew with the particular rapid intensity of children on working ranches, surrounded by animals and space, and two parents who read to him and argued in front of him without cruelty, and taught him that work was honorable, and honesty was non-negotiable. He had Edwin's dark hair and Olive's observational eyes and Thomas Garrison's stubbornness, which was a combination that produced a child who was delightful about 80% of the time and an absolute trial the other 20. Edwin expanded the ranch in 1876, purchasing the adjacent 40 acres from a family who were moving further west, and the additional land and the cattle it could support moved them from modest to genuinely comfortable, which was a shift that Olive regarded with deep satisfaction, and Edwin regarded with the particular calm of a man who had worked for something for a long time and was not surprised by its arrival, only grateful. Calder's Bluff grew too, in those years. The railroad reached it in 1876, which changed everything. The population swelled, new businesses opened. The church got a proper building separate from the schoolhouse. Dr. Fell got a medical office that was not in her home and stopped complaining about patients coming to the door at all hours, though she continued to welcome them. The Branfields had 2 more children, making the household a cacophony of truly impressive scale, and Emmett became a fixture at the Ashford Ranch every Saturday, which suited him and the horses both. Olive sent regular letters to Bate in Las Cruces, and Bate and her husband came to visit in the summer of 1876 and stayed for 2 weeks, and Bate spent most of the visit looking at Edwin and Olive with an expression that combined approval and mild jealousy, and she said on the last evening before she and her husband left, "I want you to know that I am incredibly pleased that you did not come to Las Cruces." And Olive laughed and hugged her and felt the warm, particular fullness of a life that had not gone as planned and had gone better. The nightmares about the river came only rarely now. Once or twice a year, and with less of their old violence, more the quality of something her sleeping mind still processed occasionally rather than the drowning terror it had been in those first weeks. When they came, Edwin was always there, always awake within moments of her waking, and his presence in the dark was the same thing it had always been: absolute, unhurried enough. She told Thomas about him in the garden sometimes. She told him about Edwin's terrible coffee, and his habit of singing to himself while working, and the way he had taught young Thomas the names of all the horses before the boy could form full sentences. She told him about the ranch and the good grass after the drought broke and the way Calder's Bluff had grown up around them. She told him that she had not been able to hold onto his hand in the river, and that she had carried that for a long time and that she was still carrying it, but that it had changed shape, that grief did change shape, that Edwin had been right about that too. In 1878, their second son arrived, a boy they named James, for Edwin's brother, and James Ashford proved to be entirely different from Thomas in every measurable way. Calm where his brother was volcanic, methodical where Thomas leaped, and possessed of a gentle gravity that made adults around him feel they were in the presence of someone who had arrived knowing considerably more than they did. Edwin watched James with an expression that Olive recognized as the same one he had first worn looking at her, that quality of careful attention, of someone who had found something worth knowing and intended to know it properly. Ruth Branfield's oldest girl, Clara, became, by the time she was 12, the unofficial keeper of the Ashford children during the periods when Olive was occupied with ranch business, which Olive had taken on with increasing competence, and which Edwin relied on with a completeness that was a form of respect they both recognized, and neither felt the need to name. There was a period in 1879 that was difficult, when cattle prices dropped, and two hired hands left for better prospects elsewhere, and Edwin spent a winter stretched thin between managing the shortfall and not showing it to the boys. Olive saw it anyway, because she always saw it, and she sat him down one February evening and went through the accounts with him, which he had been avoiding, and she laid out the three things they could do and the one thing they could not, and he sat across the table from her listening with his elbows on his knees, and then he said, "I do not know what I would do without you." And it was so simply and entirely meant that she reached across and put her hand over his on the table. "You will not have to find out," she said. They sold the surplus cattle and managed the winter and came through it leaner but intact, and when the spring prices recovered, it felt less like a reprieve than a confirmation that they were the kind of people who came through things, and that they were better at it together than either of them would have been alone. Dr. Fell retired from full-time practice in 1880, but did not leave Calder's Bluff, because she had by that point put 10 years into the place, and had decided it was hers in the way that Edwin had once said the land was his, not owned but claimed, not possessed but belonged to. She moved into a smaller house near the church and took on occasional consultations and became, in the way of active retired people in small towns, involved in approximately everything. She came to the Ashford ranch for supper regularly, which was an arrangement that had developed so gradually no one could point to its origin, and she sat at the table with Edwin and Olive and the boys and told stories from her years of practice, carefully anonymized, as she always was, and the boys sat with their chins in their hands listening with the focused attention of children who understood they were hearing about real things. Young Thomas, at 6, asked her once what the worst thing she had ever seen was. Dr. Fell considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, coming from someone who had asked it seriously, and said, "The worst thing I have ever seen is a person who stopped believing they were worth caring for, because that is the one condition I cannot treat with any of my medicines." And she looked briefly across the table at Olive when she said it, and Olive held her gaze and understood the specific history in the look, and felt grateful in a way that went back to a straight-backed chair in a camphor-smelling office in May of 1873. Thomas asked his mother once about the crossing, when he was 7. He had heard pieces of it. Children always heard pieces. They were better listeners than adults gave them credit for, and he asked her about it one morning in the garden with the directness that was his permanent operating mode. She told him. Not everything, not all at once, but the truth in the form that a 7-year-old could hold, that she had come across a dangerous river as part of a wagon train traveling west, and that she had lost her brother Thomas, who was his namesake in the crossing, and that she had been very sad for a long time after, and that she had come to Calder's Bluff because she needed to rest and to mend, and that this was where she had found his father. Thomas listened to all of this with the gravity of someone taking a deposition, and then said, "So if the river had not been bad, we would not be here." Olive looked at her son in the morning garden light and felt the particular vertigo of that truth, the way disaster and grace were sometimes wound together so tightly you could not separate the thread. "No," she said, "we would not." Thomas considered this for a long moment and then said, "Then it is good that the river was bad," and went back to whatever he had been doing, with the pragmatism of a child who had processed something and moved on, and Olive sat in the garden for a while afterward, looking at the plain and the sky. She told Edwin that evening what Thomas had said, and Edwin was quiet for a moment and then said very simply, "Wise boy. He gets it from somewhere," she said. "His mother's side," Edwin said, with the composed confidence of a man deflecting a compliment. "It is absolutely your side," she said. He smiled the smile that was just for her, the one that started at the corners and arrived at the full expression on a slight delay. and she thought, not for the first time, that the particular thing about a long love, a real and daily love, was not that it stayed the same as its first bright moment, but that it deepened and widened and put down roots, and that the roots were what mattered, the roots were what held against everything. The spring of 1882 was warm and good, and the ranch was doing well, and the boys were 9 and 4 and entirely different people who were entirely devoted to each other in the complicated way of brothers. Edwin had added a new section of fencing that spring, something he did methodically every year, improving the property a piece at a time with the patience of a man who understood that good things were built incrementally. And Olive stood at the kitchen window one morning watching him work, and felt a surge of love so straightforward and complete that it was almost funny, except that it was so real. She went out and stood in the yard, and he looked up from the fence post and raised an eyebrow in the questioning way he had. "Nothing," she said. "I just wanted to be out here." He nodded, with the settled acceptance of a man who had long since learned that his wife's decisions were always purposeful even when they appeared spontaneous, and went back to his work. And she stood in the warm spring morning and watched the plain where it met the sky, and listened to the sound of the hammer and the horses in the pasture, and the distant laughter of young Thomas chasing something in the barn, and she thought about the river. She thought about the river the way she had come to think about it in later years, not as the place where she had lost Thomas, though it was that, but as the place where her life had pivoted, where the terrible and the possible had arrived at the same moment, and where the road that had led here had first become visible. She thought about standing on the western bank in soaked wool skirts with nothing but a tin locket, and she thought about Edwin on the water trough outside the general store in a small town on the Texas plain, and she thought about the bench in the pre-dawn gray and the words, "I will sit up until you do." There had been a year in the middle of it all, perhaps 1876, when the nightmares had finally stopped coming regularly, when she had gone 3 months without dreaming of the river, and she had noticed, and then made the mistake of counting the days, and the counting had ended the streak. Edwin had found her sitting up in the dark after the dream returned, and he had said, entirely without frustration or disappointment, "Still here," and put the kettle on and sat with her at the kitchen table until the sky went light, and that had been the last time the river held its full old power over her sleeping hours. Some griefs did not leave, she had learned. They became incorporated, they changed form, they took up permanent residence in a chamber of the heart that was specifically shaped to hold them, and did not intrude on the rest of the house unless invited. Thomas was in there, and the river, and the guilt that she had long since stopped feeding, because Edwin had been right that it was not a paying tenant. They were in there alongside the good things, her mother's photograph in the locket, the lavender sachet that she still kept in a drawer though the scent had long since faded from the cloth, the memory of a pre-dawn bench, and a man who had chosen presence over expediency. She went back inside to make breakfast, stopping to press her hand briefly against Edwin's shoulder on the way past, which was the kind of small contact that had become as natural as breathing, and he reached up without looking and put his hand over hers for a moment before she moved on. James was in the kitchen already, which was unusual for a 4-year-old before breakfast but entirely consistent with James, who had an internal clock that his brother had never possessed, and he was sitting at the table with a piece of corn bread from the previous evening and a look of focused satisfaction. He looked up at her when she came in and said, with the gravity that was apparently his permanent register, "Mother, I am going to be a doctor." Olive considered this. "Like Dr. Fell?" "Yes," James said, "because the people need someone to help them." She looked at her younger son and thought of Dr. Fell's office and the camphor smell and the straight-back chair and the voice saying, "May I speak frankly to you, Miss Garrison?" And she said, "That is a fine thing to be, James." "Papa says I can be whatever I work hard enough at," James said, with the tone of someone citing primary sources. "Papa is right," Olive said, and put the kettle on. Edwin came in for breakfast an hour later, sun-warmed and relaxed in the manner of a man who had done good morning work. And he ate and listened to Thomas describe at length, and with great urgency, a crisis in the barn that turned out to involve a stuck door and a very put-out cat. And he provided the analysis that the crisis required and dispatched Thomas back to the barn with instructions that were simple and practical and entirely successful, which was how he handled most things. He caught Olive's eye over the table with the look they exchanged sometimes, the one that said, "This is it, this is the thing, all of this." And she held the look for a moment and then went back to her coffee, which she had made herself because she had long ago gently taken over the coffee making for reasons of basic sensory quality, though she had told Edwin it was because the task relaxed her, which was also true. The afternoon was warm and long in the way of spring afternoons in Texas, and after the midday work was done, Edwin found her in the garden, and they stood together looking out at the plain where the new grass was coming in thick and green after the winter, and the cattle were distant brown shapes against the horizon, and the sky above was the particular blue of deep spring. And there was nothing required of them for the next several minutes except to stand there together in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of the life they had built. "I want to ask you something," Olive said. He waited, attentive in the old familiar way. "Are you happy?" She asked him, returning the question he had asked her on their wedding night, asking it now across the span of almost 9 years. He did not rush the answer. He looked out at the plain and at the cattle and at the sky, and he looked at her, and he said with the directness of someone who had always preferred honesty to comfort, "I am happier than I knew was possible for a man who is doing simple work in a small place. Yes, completely." She nodded and looked back at the plain. "Are you?" he asked. "I am going to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it the way it is meant." She paused. "When I was standing on the western bank of the Red River in my soaked skirts with nothing and no one left, I could not have imagined this. I could not have imagined any part of it. And I want you to know that every single piece of it, the ranch, the boys, the life, has exceeded what I could have imagined by so much that I do not have adequate language for it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I sat on a bench outside the general store at 3 in the morning with a woman I had known for 5 days because I could not think of anything more important to do with my time," he said. "And I was right." She laughed the surprised, full laugh, and he laughed with her, which was still the best sound she knew, and the spring afternoon wrapped around them on the Texas plain, and the grass was green and the sky was enormous, and their sons were somewhere behind them in the house being whatever they were being, and Olive Garrison Ashford stood in her garden with her husband's hand finding hers and thought, "Yes, this is it, this is the whole of it, and it is enough, and it is more than enough, and it is mine." That night she slept, as she had slept for years now, full and unbroken, with Edwin's arm around her and the window open to the warm Texas darkness, and the sound of cattle distant on the plain, and the tin locket on the nightstand where it had sat for 9 years, its photograph of her mother worn soft from handling, Thomas's image there in her heart where he had always been and would always be, and the lavender sachet in the drawer where she would never throw it out. And the whole long story of how she had come to be here laid out behind her like a road she had walked without knowing where it led, arriving finally at this. A room, a man, a house, 2 boys asleep down the hall, and the kind of sleep that only came to someone who had at last come home.